There's just so few of them. They're literally attacking the villages and killing the inhabitants. But like, couldn't they have more? More monsters is quite literally the opposite of our job here. Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, this series is called Monster Hunter for a reason. It immediately makes you think of the two most important parts of the game, the monsters and the hunters. And when you consider which of those words comes first, it's clear who the real main characters are in this series. Monsters and their design quality are quite possibly the biggest factor in each player's enjoyment of a Monster Hunter game, whether they realize it or not. And while there are other parts to it, of course, things like the weapons themselves, their moveset, their combat, I think monsters matter the most overall, especially considering that different players will use different weapon types, but we all hunt the same monsters. That said, one of the common ways to judge a Monster Hunter game is the strength or quality of its monster roster, all the monsters in that game. And I've seen a lot of complaints about the Monster Hunter Wilds roster from people who are lacking a lot of context or just outright misstating how things worked for previous games. And so today I wanted to give my own thoughts and opinions on the roster in comparison to recent Monster Hunter base game rosters, specifically base game as in before any title updates, coming from someone who has essentially made Monster Hunter their life for nearly a decade now, so I'll do my best to accurately portray any timelines on things as we go, with a note as well that I know information about Title Update 1 does exist for Wilds, and it is plentiful and a lot of people all know it, but I am avoiding all knowledge of that update until I'm able to play it myself in a few days hopefully, so if it sounds like I'm missing some Title Update context for Wilds, that will be why. That said, let's start by looking at the Wilds roster itself. Start to finish, all entries included, Wilds has 29 monsters in the base game. For a measure of variety, we've got 1 amphibian, 2 brute wyverns, 2 temnocerans, 4 fanged beasts, 4 leviathans, 5 flying wyverns, 2 cephalopods, which are a brand new monster type, 6 constructs, which is another technically new class of monster, 2 bird wyverns, and then gore magala, who is freshly classified as a demi-elder, a new category of monster in Wilds. Obviously gore magala existed before, but he never actually technically had a category. It was always just question mark, question mark, question mark. That said, there is 10 different monster types in Monster Hunter Wilds, and if you want to get technical, you can instead break the guardians down into their base categories too, instead of being constructs, and you would still get 10 different monster types, because Guardian Ebony Odogaron would be a fanged wyvern, because Ebony Odogaron is, and the only monster of that type in all of Wilds is him. There is no fanged wyverns. Other than that, he's just technically a construct first and foremost. As well, at that point, Shia would probably be considered an Elder Dragon, which would bump the count up even further to 11 different types, because we don't technically have an Elder Dragon in Wilds. But for now, let's just call it 10 and count constructs as their own thing. To compare this to Monster Hunter World, that game had 30 large monsters at release, not counting the title updates. Among those were 3 bird wyverns, 4 brute wyverns, 5 fanged wyverns, 9 flying wyverns, 2 piscine wyverns, and 7 elder dragons. So 6 different monster types, and this is a relatively simple scale, but it shows that the larger scale monster variety was much lower in World, even though there was 1 more monster overall. As for Monster Hunter Rise, the base game had the largest monster roster outside of Monster Hunter Generations, the game built to be a sort of anthology of Monster Hunter monsters, at 37 base game monsters, though a lot of people will instantly count out the Apex monsters, but we will get to that later. For now, the same concept of monster variety by typing: 1 amphibian, 6 bird wyverns, 2 brute wyverns, 1 piscine wyvern, 7 fanged beasts, 3 fanged wyverns, 9 flying wyverns, 5 leviathan, 1 temnoceran, and 2 elder dragons, for a total of 10 different monster types, so actually essentially the same amount of face value variety as Wilds, both of which being notably more variety than World. But when you look at the number per type, you can see it is weighted heavily towards flying wyverns and fanged beasts in Rise. That's it. Now let's talk more about quantity as well, because Rise has the distinction of having the most base game monsters out of these 3 titles at 37. Of those 37, 3 of them are Apex monsters that, on release of the game, could only be fought as part of the Rampage system, and between the fact that Apex monsters were essentially just imitation remakes of Deviants from Generations to Generations Ultimate, and the fact that the Rampage was itself such a departure from normal Monster Hunter gameplay to the point where a lot of people complained about it a lot, to the point where it literally wasn't even a part of Sunbreak when the expansion happened, despite being a major part of the base game. That said, a lot of players didn't really count the Apex monsters as being a proper part part of the roster at a time, or at least not new monsters, though they did eventually get regular quests and that sort of fixed some of the problems. So 3 of those 37 have a bit of an asterisk on them, and then Wind Serpent Ibushi has a similar issue of only being a rampage fight, at least at launch, despite being undeniably a fully new monster. I'd argue similar to Ibushi's situation would be Zora Magdaros in Monster Hunter World, who was only available as a siege fight, and a lot of people barely even considered it an actual hunt. But the point is that both of these monsters come with major asterisks to the community as a whole, and I think it similarly matches a couple of entries in Wilds I've heard people complain about too, being Guardian Arkveld, who for all intents and purposes is just low rank Arkveld with some slight visual differences and moveset differences too, but he doesn't show up at all as a thing in high rank. And then Shia, who is only available in low rank despite being the final boss of the proper story, and I've said it a bunch, hopefully this will be changed or fixed in a title update for Monster Hunter Wilds, but we're comparing the base launch titles, the state of the game right now, and Wilds at launch only has this monster in low rank. Adding onto that for another method of comparison then, out of the 29 monsters in Wilds, only 9 of them are returning. The other 20 monsters are new, with the consideration that a few of those are Guardians, which is a subspecies type equivalent, and in World we had 18 new monsters out of the 30, so 2 less than we have in Wilds, and in Rise, out of the 37 monsters on that massive roster, only 14 were actually new, only 11 if you discount the Apexes for being built directly from the Deviants instead of being fully new creatures, which means that of all of these, despite having the smallest overall roster of the 3, Wilds has the most new monsters. It has the largest percentage of new monsters in its overall roster as well, as an extension of that. It has the most diverse roster as far as the types of monsters, not even excluding just how different Wilds monsters get within these. Like the fact that Chemitrice and Rompopolo are the same type of monster, these are both brute wyverns, or that Hirabami and Duna, as near polar opposites of each other, are both leviathans, even still. And on top of all of this, the big thing that I really want to drive home as my main points here is the actual quality of this roster too. Monster Hunter has always been known for creating top quality creature designs. Even the ones that are less visually interesting to some people are usually ecologically interesting, or have an interesting moveset to actually fight, and vice versa as well. Though a lot of the time a roster will have its notable sort of duds too. Not monsters that are necessarily bad, but ones that you rarely ever hear people talking about or thinking about, and really positive things when they do. The forgotten monsters, so to say, is probably the best way to put it. In World, the biggest example was Juratotis, who people outright disliked without even trying to hide it, and in Rise, the roster was honestly quite polarizing. Great Azuchi, a lot of people consider quite forgettable, but then there are people who love Almudron and people who absolutely despise Almudron. He's a very sort of back and forth type of creature, and I've heard similar things said about Somnicanth and some of the other new monsters in Rise too. Wilds, to me, does not have any of this in the slightest. Every last member of the roster is memorable for one reason or another. Not even just the new monsters, even the returning ones come back in such a memorable way. The first monster that we properly hunt in this game is Chotacabra, who is up there in the top tier of opening large monsters to me. He's my favorite one of them personally, but I think objectively he's one of the best opening monsters they've ever put in. Even Chemitrice, who I think is one of the less actually unique monsters in Wilds, is honestly awesome. I mean, he's a big chunky rooster with a big chunky, just grabbable, squeezable little rooster face. The actual visuals of his tail doing what it does, even just his tail existing, the sounds that he makes, and just how needlessly aggressive he is getting himself in situations that are way out of his league, giving himself a hilarious little personality. I love the little guy, I love his equipment too. He may be my lowest rated monster on the list that I made for Wilds, the tier list I made a few days ago, but I couldn't imagine the game without him in it, because despite me liking all of the other new monsters more than him, I still really do like Chemitrice, and I would fight for his right to be in this game if somebody questioned it, and I simply don't have that level of passion for Great Azuchi or for Juratotis. The other side of it is counting threatening monsters, things that count as endgame farm, and that's the one spot where I think it's a matter of mentality, really. In Monster Hunter World's base endgame, all 5 of the Elder Dragons were equally worth farming for base game endgame, but over time the meta developed towards farming Valhazak specifically as the easiest Elder, and so while there were 5 options, it essentially was 1 option for pure efficiency, and then 4 that were nearly as good. In Rise, they uniquely set it up so that you could technically hunt any monster to progress the endgame, which I think is great, but of course people found the most technically correct farm option option, which was running Thunder Serpent Narwa over and over on repeat. So again, the one option there for pure efficiency, but then a lot more options if you cared less about the optimal strategy. For example, a lot of my endgame farming in base Monster Hunter Rise was Gossarag, because I love that monster. But now in Wilds, we have Arkveld as the top tier of rewards, undeniably, and then gore Magala and the Apex monsters just slightly below. Functionally, this is very similar to the amount of good farmable monsters in World, but I've had to guess purely because Arkveld counts as an 8-star quest, and Tempered Gore and the Apexes count as 7-star. A whole lot of people are just refusing to do anything but Arkveld and making the roster feel a whole lot smaller than it is for themselves, despite 7-star investigations having barely any less reward potential than 8-star. So again, it's one monster that is absolutely optimal farm, but then like 5 that are honestly just behind it, and the people that refuse to farm the other ones are just making their own experience worse. Not to mention that a lot of the most valuable quests that you can have as investigations in Wilds are double monster investigations, which again opens you up to fighting a lot more of the roster than just those top couple of monsters. Overall, the point that I'm trying to make is that by looking at numbers without context, it's easy to say that Wilds has a problem because it has less monsters than the previous 2 base games, especially because a lot of people include title update monsters while making those comparisons for some reason. But if you break it all down, you will see that despite Wilds having less monsters overall, even with 2 out of the 29 monsters locked to only being low rank, it is still the highest number of new monsters that we have had in a Monster Hunter game ever, even more than Monster Hunter Tri, even more than the literal first Monster Hunter game, where every monster was new because it was a new game. And among this roster, we have a whopping 10 monster types, 11 if you are someone who doesn't like counting constructs, which makes it even more impressive if anything, and among those monster types, the actual variety of monster is staggering as well. Literal quantity might be lower than it was in recent base Monster Hunter games, but quality is at such an unbelievably high standard in Wilds, and that's my stance on the whole thing. I don't know if you'd all agree with me. After all, in the end, a few of my final points were definitely subjective observations about my thoughts on the monsters, but a lot of this was just numbers and facts because I'm tired of people saying that Wilds has a monster problem compared to previous recent Monster Hunter games, because that's just a failure to understand context as far as I'm concerned. That does it for today then, everyone. A talk about the monster roster in Wilds compared mostly to World and Rise, as I keep seeing people have this conversation in what feels like bad faith towards Wild specifically. So here's my take on all of it. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and let me know any of your own thoughts on this down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world our stage. Goodbye.